It was a bright Saturday afternoon. The mall was full of people, families shopping, couples walking hand in hand, and children laughing near the fountain. Expensive shops lined both sides, and soft music played from the speakers above. In the middle of the crowd walked a young black boy named Leo. He was just 7 years old, wearing neat clothes, a blue polo shirt, white sneakers, and a little backpack with stars on it. Walking beside him was his nanny, Miss Clara, a kind woman in her 50s who had cared for him since he was a baby. Leo's eyes were full of wonder. Everything in the mall was big and shiny. The glass walls, the bright lights, the smell of popcorn, and new shoes. It all made him smile. Miss Clara held his hand and said kindly, "Stay close to me, Leo. This place is busy." Leo nodded. "Yes, Miss Clara." But then, it happened. Leo saw a toy display in the window of a store. He turned his head and took one small step forward, just one step too fast. In that moment, he accidentally bumped into a woman coming out of a high-end store. Her shopping bags fell. A scarf dropped to the floor. She looked down sharply. She was a tall, well-dressed white woman with bright red lipstick, gold earrings, and a tight bun. Her name was Mrs. Carter, and she was known in town for her loud voice and sharp tongue. She narrowed her eyes and asked coldly, "What is wrong with you?" Before Leo could speak, before Miss Clara could react, Mrs. Carter slapped Leo across the face. The loud smack echoed across the mall hallway. Everything froze. People stopped walking. A nearby cashier gasped. A couple who were eating ice cream turned to look. Leo held his cheek with his little hand. He didn't cry. He just looked confused, like he didn't understand what just happened. Miss Clara rushed forward and pulled him close. "You hit him," she shouted. "He's just a child." Mrs. Carter stood tall, fixing her bag straps. "This is a classy place, not a daycare," she snapped. "Maybe next time, teach your kid some manners." Miss Clara was shaking. "You think that's okay? Hitting a child? Your child should watch where he's going," Mrs. Carter replied with a cruel smirk. A small crowd began to form. People whispered. Phones came out. Someone started recording. But Leo stayed quiet. His eyes were calm. He didn't look angry. He didn't look scared. He turned his head slightly and tugged on Miss Clara's hand. Then, in a soft, clear voice, he whispered, "Should I call Daddy now?" Miss Clara froze. Mrs. Carter blinked. What did he say? Leo looked up at his nanny. "Should I call him? He told me to press the top button if anything bad happens." Miss Clara looked at Leo, then glanced around nervously. "You sure?" she asked. Leo nodded. "He won't be happy." Mrs. Carter gave a short laugh. "What's he going to do? Bring a lawyer?" Leo didn't answer. He reached into his small backpack, pulled out a sleek black phone, and calmly pressed one button. He held the phone to his ear and waited. People leaned in. Cameras pointed at him now. Mrs. Carter looked annoyed, not worried. Then Leo spoke just one sentence into the phone. "Dad, someone hit me." He didn't say more. He just listened. Then slowly nodded and said, "Okay, I'll wait." He hung up and put the phone back in his bag. Miss Clara didn't say a word. Her eyes were wide. Mrs. Carter rolled her eyes. "This is ridiculous. What, is your dad a police officer?" Leo didn't reply. But Miss Clara finally found her voice. She looked at Mrs. Carter and said quietly, "You're about to find out who his father is." The crowd didn't move. The air felt heavy. And Leo, he simply stood there, holding his nanny's hand, as calm as ever. The mall no longer felt loud or bright. It was quiet, like something big was coming. And everyone could feel it. The seconds felt like hours. The whole mall seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen next. Mrs. Carter stood there, arms crossed, still pretending she wasn't worried. She shot one last look at Leo, her eyes full of irritation. "Do you think you can just call your daddy and make everything better?" she asked, sneering. Leo didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the ground, and he stood so still that it almost seemed like he was waiting for something big to happen. His calmness only made the situation feel more intense. Miss Clara stood by his side, still in shock. She had seen her fair share of bad moments, but this was different. Leo was quiet, waiting for his father's call. Then his phone rang. It was a simple sound, a clean ring, but to the people around, it felt like a bell signaling the start of something huge. Leo didn't hesitate. He reached into his backpack, took the phone out, and answered. "Hello," he said, his voice soft but steady. On the other end of the line, there was a deep, calm voice. It was the voice of a man who had seen more of the world than most people ever would, a voice that carried weight and authority, yet had warmth for his son. "Leo," the voice asked gently, "what happened?" "Miss Clara said you needed me." Leo spoke quietly, almost in a whisper, but everyone could hear the seriousness in his tone. "Someone hit me," he said simply. There was a brief silence on the other end. Mrs. Carter raised an eyebrow, clearly not understanding what was happening. Leo's voice had been so calm. Why wasn't he scared? Why wasn't he crying? "Where are you?" the voice on the phone asked. Leo looked up at Miss Clara. "We're at the mall," he said. "Okay, I'll be there soon," the voice replied. "Stay where you are." Leo nodded. "I will, Dad. I'll wait." The call ended. The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Carter seemed confused. Was this some kind of joke? Who was this man? Why did a 7-year-old child have such a serious phone call? The atmosphere in the mall had changed. People stopped their conversations, started glancing over. Security, who had been quietly watching from the corner, started moving toward the scene, unsure of what was going on. Minutes passed. It felt like time was moving slower now. Mrs. Carter still couldn't understand. She shifted from one foot to the other, looking at her watch, then at the entrance of the mall. Nothing had happened yet. Leo didn't move. He simply stood there, his hand still in Miss Clara's, his eyes looking around as if nothing strange was happening. He didn't seem worried. In fact, he almost looked bored, like he knew what was about to unfold. Then, almost as if on cue, a black SUV pulled up outside the mall entrance. People turned their heads. The SUV's tinted windows reflected the sunlight as it slowly came to a stop. The door of the SUV opened. Out stepped a tall man in a well-fitted suit. His presence was calm but commanding. His movements were smooth and confident, as if he knew exactly where he was going and why. It was David King, the billionaire CEO of a successful tech company. He was a man known across the country, a man with power, wealth, and influence. He was the type of person whose name could change the fate of a business or make headlines without lifting a finger. And now he was walking toward Leo. People couldn't help but stare. The silence in the mall grew thicker. Mrs. Carter blinked and took a step back. Security guards quickly approached, but when they saw who it was, they hesitated, then stepped aside. David King walked directly to Leo. He kneeled down in front of him, his face softening with concern. "Hey, champ," he said gently, his voice warm and familiar. "Are you okay?" Leo looked up at him and nodded. "I'm fine, Dad." David smiled, then looked at Miss Clara, who was standing beside them. "Is everything all right here?" he asked calmly. Miss Clara nodded quickly, still in shock from everything that had just happened. "Yes, sir. We're fine." David's eyes turned to Mrs. Carter, who was now standing a few feet away, her face pale and her hands clutching her shopping bags. "Who did this?" David asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "Who hit my son?" Mrs. Carter didn't know how to respond. She opened her mouth but found no words. David stood slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, In a calm but firm voice, he said, "You've made a big mistake, and you will regret it." The crowd around them gasped. Mrs. Carter took a step back, her face pale. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. Her anger, her confidence, it was all fading fast. David pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. He didn't say anything for a moment. The tension in the air was palpable. Then he turned to security and the mall owner, who had just appeared, looking anxious. "Shut this mall down," David said simply. The mall had gone completely silent. David King stood tall, his expression calm but filled with authority. His words had just hit the air like a stone in a calm pond, causing ripples of shock. "Shut this mall down." No one moved at first. The security guards, the mall owner, even Mrs. Carter, they all just stared at David like he was speaking a language they couldn't understand. The tension was thick. It felt as though the entire mall was holding its breath, waiting for someone to make the next move. David's phone still rested in his hand, his eyes locked onto the mall owner. He didn't need to say anything more. His presence spoke for him. His wealth, his power, everything about him screamed that he could make the impossible happen. The mall owner, a middle-aged man with nervous eyes, finally stepped forward. "Mr. King, please." David raised a hand, cutting him off. "Do you know who I am?" he asked in a low voice, but the words felt like a challenge. His calmness was the only thing that made his presence even more intimidating. The mall owner's face paled. "Of course, sir. I didn't mean any disrespect." David nodded slowly. "Good, because what happened here is a disrespect I won't tolerate. Do you know how many people would love to do business with me?" He glanced at the stunned crowd around him. "But this woman, she just tried to teach my son a lesson she isn't qualified to teach." He turned and faced Mrs. Carter, who was still standing at a distance, her face turning redder by the second. She tried to speak, but her words were lost in the chaos of the moment. "I don't know who you think you are," David said, stepping toward her, his voice now colder. "But I'm about to show you exactly how much you matter to me." He didn't even flinch. "How much you matter to anyone." Mrs. Carter stumbled back. She tried to put on a brave face, but her hands trembled. David continued, his voice now firm. "This mall just became my business. I'm buying it." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one could believe what they had just heard. Buying the mall. The crowd began to murmur. Whispers filled the air. The mall owner's jaw dropped. "Wait, Mr. King, you can't." David's phone rang again, interrupting him. He answered it without hesitation. "Yes." A few seconds later, he nodded. His expression changed, but only slightly. "All right, I'll take care of it." Then, David hung up. He looked at the mall owner and spoke slowly. "In fact, I'm not just buying this mall. I'm shutting it down for good." The mall owner's eyes widened. What do you mean? You can't." David gave him a sharp look, one that made the man swallow his words. "Don't make me repeat myself." The crowd around them had begun to grow, and every face in the mall was turned toward them. They watched in awe, unsure whether they were witnessing a dream or a nightmare. David smiled, but it was a smile that held no warmth. "You'll regret this," Mrs. Carter finally managed to say, her voice shaking with anger. "You can't do this. People will think you're crazy." David didn't respond to her. Instead, he turned to his son, Leo, who was standing quietly beside Miss Clara. "Leo," David said softly, his voice now warm and comforting. "Are you okay?" Leo nodded, his calm face still unshaken. "I'm fine, Daddy." David smiled at him, the warmth returning to his eyes. "Good. Let's go home, champ. You've had a rough day." But just as they were about to leave, David turned back to Mrs. Carter. "You still don't get it, do you?" he asked. "This isn't just about hitting my son. This is about you forgetting your place. You've messed with the wrong person." Mrs. Carter tried to fight back, but the words wouldn't come. The power in David's voice, his calm, collected manner, it was too much. David didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to argue. He had the power, and everyone knew it. David signaled for Miss Clara and Leo to follow him. But before they left, he gave one last look at Mrs. Carter. "I want you to think about what you've done," he said quietly, "because the next time we meet, it won't be in this mall." He turned to the security guards, who were now fully backing away from the scene. "Get her out of here." With that, David walked away, his son by his side, his nanny following close behind. But the story wasn't over. As they exited the mall, the staff began to move quickly, locking up the stores, shutting down the lights, and clearing the area. David's influence was powerful. The mall wasn't just shut down, it was closed for good. The crowd stared in disbelief as they saw the mall doors close, the lights flicker off, and the sound of rolling security gates echo through the now empty space. The next morning, the news spread like wildfire. Billionaire closes down mall over incident. With child, the headlines were everywhere. David King's name was on every front page. Social media exploded with comments, debates, and questions. Some people praised him, others criticized him. But everyone was talking about him. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter was nowhere to be found. She hadn't posted anything on her social media accounts, and her phone was off. People started wondering, was she hiding? Or was she just too ashamed to speak? At the King mansion, David sat at his desk in his study, looking over the morning news. He scanned the articles, reading through the opinions, both positive and negative. He wasn't surprised by the reactions, but he was pleased with how quickly the story had caught attention. Leo walked into the room, still in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "Dad, I saw the news. Why is everyone talking about us?" David smiled softly, setting down the paper. "Because some people don't like to see things change. They don't understand the way the world works. But they will, eventually." Leo's face lit up with curiosity. "So, did we really close the mall for good?" David nodded. "Yes, we did. But it's not just about the mall. It's about making sure no one ever forgets the power of influence." Leo tilted his head. "But why did we do it, Daddy? Wasn't it just because of what happened to me?" David's eyes softened as he looked at his son. "It was about more than just what happened to you, Leo. It was about showing the world that no one, no matter who they are or what they have, can get away with disrespecting others. Especially you." Leo nodded thoughtfully, still processing his father's words. Meanwhile, across town, Mrs. Carter was meeting with a group of her colleagues and lawyers. The mood in the room was tense. Mrs. Carter had spent the entire night hiding, avoiding the media, and trying to figure out what to do next. Her lawyer, a tall man with glasses, spoke first. "Mrs. Carter, we need to talk about the situation with David King. There are a lot of moving parts here, and the press is circling like sharks. We need to get ahead of this before it escalates further." Mrs. Carter's face twisted with anger. "I don't care about the press. I care about what he did to me. Closing that mall, that was too much." The lawyer raised his hand. "I understand your frustration, but you need to think about your next move. This isn't just about a slap. This is about power. And David King is a very powerful man. He doesn't play by the same rules as most people." Mrs. Carter's lips tightened. She didn't like being told that she was at a disadvantage, but she knew the lawyer was right. David's influence was vast. If she went against him directly, it could destroy her career. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that kind of fight. But she wasn't backing down. Not yet. Back at the King mansion, David stood by the window, looking out over the vast grounds. His mind was busy, thinking of what to do next. He had already made his point, but there was something more he needed to do. Leo walked over and tugged at his father's sleeve. "Daddy, what happens now?" David knelt down to his son's level and smiled. "Now we wait. People need to learn that actions have consequences, And sometimes, the right consequence comes when you least expect it. Back at the mall, the closure was already causing a stir. Shoppers who had been regular customers found themselves locked out, their plans interrupted by David's sudden decision. Employees were confused, and many began to fear for their jobs. The mall owner, still trying to regain control of his business, was in talks with investors, but nothing was going as planned. He had hoped the situation would blow over, but now it seemed as if David's influence was more than just a powerful force. It was a reality that had changed everything. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Carter finally made her move. She stepped out of her house, looking more confident than before. She had called a press conference to address the situation. She was determined to clear her name and get back to her life. The press gathered quickly, their cameras flashing as she walked to the podium. "I know what you're all thinking," she began, her voice shaky but strong. "Yes, I slapped that boy. But I did it out of frustration. I'm a businesswoman. I don't have time to deal with children running around in high-end malls. I didn't expect the situation to blow up like this." She paused, looking around at the reporters. "But I'm not afraid of David King. I've made my own success, and I'll continue to do so, no matter what anyone thinks." The press immediately erupted with questions, but Mrs. Carter held her ground. She was ready to fight back. But little did she know, David King was already one step ahead. The morning after Mrs. Carter's press conference, the world was waiting for David King's response. His legal team had already been working behind the scenes, quietly gathering evidence, making calls, and preparing for their next move. David wasn't one to make threats. He made moves. Powerful, calculated moves. At the King mansion, David sat at his desk, flipping through legal documents. His assistant, James, stood beside him, holding his phone with an urgent look on his face. "Mr. King," James said, "we've got something you need to see." David raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his chair. "What is it?" James handed over the phone. "It's a video." Mrs. Carter just made her statement to the press. But what she said, it's not sitting well with a lot of people. David clicked on the video and watched. Mrs. Carter was speaking confidently, but her words seemed off, almost like she was avoiding the real issue. The reporters were pressing her, and her frustration was clear. She tried to stay calm, but there was something about her tone that made her sound defensive. David shook his head. "She doesn't get it. She still thinks this is about a slap. But it's much bigger than that." James nodded. "Exactly. And now her response has just made her a bigger target. People are starting to talk. You were right to make your move." As David was strategizing, his legal team was already putting their plan into action. By midday, the news hit. David King had filed a lawsuit against Mrs. Carter. The case was for defamation, public humiliation, and damage to reputation. The press had a field day. David King strikes back. One headline read, "Billionaire files lawsuit against woman who slapped his son." At the same time, the situation was quickly escalating. The once famous Mrs. Carter, a successful businesswoman in her own right, now found herself surrounded by reporters and angry social media posts. People were starting to side with David, praising him for standing up for his son. They were calling him a father figure who protected his child's dignity, while Mrs. Carter was being painted as the villain. Her phone buzzed again. It was another message from her lawyer. She opened it quickly. "We need to settle this immediately. David King is no one to mess with." Mrs. Carter read the message and scoffed. Settle. She was done running from David King. But what other choice did she have? The walls were closing in. Hours later, Mrs. Carter found herself sitting in a luxurious office with her lawyer. She didn't want to hear what he had to say, but she knew she had no choice. "We've been in touch with David's team," the lawyer explained. "They want a public apology. They're also demanding that you pay for the damages. They're going to sue for a large amount if this goes to court." Mrs. Carter slammed her fist on the table. "I'll never apologize. I don't care about the money. This is about respect. The lawyer sighed. I understand, but you're not dealing with just any person here. David King is a force. You're already seeing the public backlash. If this keeps going, it won't just ruin your business. It will destroy your reputation. People will remember you as the woman who slapped a child in front of a mall. Mrs. Carter crossed her arms. I'm not backing down. But I need to come up with something. Her lawyer looked at her gravely. The longer you wait, the worse this will get. Meanwhile, David was watching all of this unfold. He knew the power of the media. He had spent years building a reputation, not just as a businessman, but as someone who made things happen when he chose to. He wasn't trying to crush Mrs. Carter for a slap. He was making a point. There are consequences to disrespecting people, especially when those people had the power to make change. David's phone rang again. It was his lawyer. Mr. King, we've got an update. Mrs. Carter is asking for a meeting. She wants to settle. David chuckled softly. Tell her to bring her lawyer. But let her know she's already lost. The meeting was set for the following afternoon. The conference room was tense. Mrs. Carter sat across from David, her lawyer beside her. David had come alone, exuding confidence in his power. He didn't need a team to face her. He had already won the battle. Mrs. Carter started, her voice trembling slightly. I don't want to make this any worse. I'll apologize, but I won't admit that I was wrong in everything. David leaned forward, his eyes cold. You're not in a position to make demands. I didn't file a lawsuit for an apology. I filed it to make you understand that people like you can't go around treating others like they're beneath you. Her lawyer spoke up. What do you want from her, Mr. King? You've already made your point. David glanced at him, then back at Mrs. Carter. I want her to never forget who she's dealing with. If she walks out of here thinking she's won, she'll continue to hurt others. But if she learns her lesson, maybe there's a chance to move on. The tension in the room was thick. Mrs. Carter's palms were sweating as she sat in front of David King. She could feel the weight of his stare, cold and calculating. This wasn't just about the apology anymore. It was about power, respect, and her future. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his chair, watching the exchange unfold. Mrs. Carter had made up her mind. She was not going to back down. She had worked too hard to get where she was, and she wasn't about to let David King crush her career just because of one mistake. David looked at Mrs. Carter, his voice calm but firm. I don't want to keep this going. You don't want that either. So here's the deal. You apologize publicly, and you agree to donate a large sum to a charity of Leo's choice. It won't undo the harm, but it will show that you understand the consequences of your actions. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed. So you want me to publicly admit I was wrong and give money away? That's how you win this. David didn't flinch. No, this isn't about winning. This is about teaching you a lesson and making sure people know that they can't disrespect others without facing consequences. You may think you have power in the business world, but respect is earned, not bought. Her lawyer cleared his throat. David, this is an extremely generous offer, considering the situation. But let's be clear. Mrs. Carter is not the villain in this story. She made a mistake, yes, but she doesn't deserve to lose everything over it. David's eyes flashed with irritation, but his voice remained steady. She already lost. This is the only way she can start to fix what's broken. Mrs. Carter was silent for a moment. She looked down at her hands, trying to find the right words. She was used to getting her way, used to being the one in control. But here, in this room, she was not in control. She felt the power slipping away, piece by piece. Finally, she lifted her head and met David's gaze. Fine, she said, her voice tight. I'll apologize, but I won't donate to any charity. I'll write a statement, and I'll publicly express my regret. But I won't make myself a fool. David studied her, weighing her words. He could tell she was reluctant, but at least she was conceding something. It was a start. You'll do more than just apologize, David said coldly. The donation stays. The apology must be sincere, and it must come from the heart. If you think you can get out of this without real accountability, you're wrong. Mrs. Carter's frustration was clear. I've already agreed to apologize. What more do you want from me? David leaned forward, his voice lower now. I want you to understand that your actions have consequences, and I want you to know that if you think you can just apologize and move on, you're wrong. People will remember what you did. They'll remember your arrogance. You'll be lucky if your business survives this. Mrs. Carter stood up abruptly, shaking her head. You're not going to destroy me. I will rebuild. You'll see. But I won't be bullied into submission. David remained seated, his calm demeanor unwavering. No one is bullying you. This is just the reality of power. You had it, and you misused it. Now, you will learn what happens when you do. Outside the building, reporters waited eagerly. Word had already spread that a decision had been made behind closed doors, and the public was desperate to know what it was. Was Mrs. Carter going to fight back? Or would she cave to David King's demands? Mrs. Carter stepped out of the building, flanked by her lawyer. The crowd immediately started snapping pictures, shouting her name, demanding answers. She didn't say a word. Her lips were pressed tightly together, her face a mask of anger and frustration. She walked to the waiting car, her lawyer following closely behind. They had a lot to work out, a lot of damage to repair. Back at the King mansion, David watched the scene unfold on his TV. He saw the headlines flashing across the screen. Mrs. Carter agrees to public apology after lawsuit from David King. The corner of his mouth twitched into a faint smile. The battle was over, but the war for respect was just beginning. The days following Mrs. Carter's apology were filled with intense media coverage. The world watched closely as she went from being a villain to trying to rebuild her reputation. Her public apology was heartfelt, and the donation to Leo's chosen charity was made. But despite her efforts to regain her image, something unexpected began to happen, something no one had predicted. David King had known this would be a hard lesson for Mrs. Carter, but even he hadn't anticipated just how much the media and the public would embrace the story. The more they learned about her past behavior and the way she treated others, the more they turned against her. The donation, though a step in the right direction, wasn't enough to erase the stain of arrogance that had come to define her. Meanwhile, Leo and his father, David, continued their quiet lives away from the chaos. Leo, only 7 years old, had no idea how his small act of courage had set off a chain of events that had shaken the world. But one thing was clear: he had made his father proud. One afternoon, as Leo played with his toys at home, David received a call from a familiar voice. Mrs. Carter. I need to talk, she said, her tone sounding different than it had before. David leaned back in his chair. I thought we were done with this. Mrs. Carter's voice faltered. I know, but I want to say something. Something personal. I was wrong, and I need you to hear it from me. It's not about the business anymore. I'm sorry for what I did. To you, to Leo. It was wrong. David paused for a moment, taking in her words. There was no anger in his voice now, just a deep sense of finality. You're finally seeing the truth, he said. You'll never be the same after this. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. People learn, they change, but only if they're willing to face the consequences. Weeks later, a small article caught David's eye in the news. It wasn't about Mrs. Carter's apology or the lawsuit, but rather something unexpected. Mrs. Carter had announced her decision to step down from her position as CEO of her company. She stated that she was taking a break to reflect and grow. David didn't feel satisfaction from this news. In fact, he felt something he didn't expect: pity. In the quiet of his study, David looked at Leo, who was reading a book on the couch. You did good, son, David said, his voice full of pride. Leo looked up, his eyes full of innocence. I just told the truth. She hurt me. David smiled softly. That's all it takes sometimes. Telling the truth and standing up for what's right. As for Mrs. Carter, her business began to suffer. Clients pulled away, and her image never truly recovered. She tried to make a comeback, but the public had already made their decision. They didn't forget how she had treated a child. And they certainly didn't forget the way she had tried to dodge responsibility for her actions. In the end, Mrs. Carter's story became one of caution, a reminder that respect and integrity were worth more than power or wealth. She learned the hard way that the world would not tolerate disrespect, especially when it came to children. Months had passed since the ordeal at the mall. Mrs. Carter had left the business world behind and begun to focus on something completely new. She had retreated to a quiet, secluded life where no cameras followed her and no reporters lingered outside her door. She had tried to rebuild not just her reputation, but herself. In the isolation, Mrs. Carter started to see the world through a different lens, one that wasn't clouded by arrogance or pride. One afternoon, she received an invitation from David King. The invitation was simple, handwritten, and marked with a sense of sincerity. "You've made mistakes. Now let's help you make things right." Mrs. Carter hesitated at first. She had done her best to stay away from David and Leo, but deep down, she knew this was the right moment. She couldn't keep hiding forever. She had to take responsibility. And more than that, she had to make amends. When she arrived at David's home, she was greeted by Leo, who was now 8 years old. The child's innocent eyes seemed to carry a weight of wisdom far beyond his years. He gave her a small, almost shy smile before stepping aside. David stood at the doorway, waiting. "I'm here to make things right," Mrs. Carter said, her voice quieter than before. It wasn't filled with pride or defense, only sincerity. David studied her, as if weighing her words, before gesturing for her to come inside. "I know you've been trying," he said, "but redemption is a slow process. It's not about grand gestures. It's about showing up every day and doing the right thing. We'll start with the small steps." Weeks turned into months, and Mrs. Carter worked alongside David, not just for business, but to learn how to give back. She started small, helping in the community, working with children, and volunteering at the same charity Leo had chosen when she made the donation. She never spoke about her past in public, never tried to justify her actions. Instead, she used her experience as a way to teach others about the value of humility. One day, while volunteering at a local shelter, Mrs. Carter saw a familiar face in the crowd. It was a young mother, struggling to make ends meet, looking lost and out of place. Mrs. Carter walked up to her, offering a gentle smile. "I know what it feels like to feel like you're at the bottom," she said, her voice soft yet full of understanding. "But you're not alone." The woman's eyes filled with tears as Mrs. Carter placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. In that moment, she realized how much of her own inner peace came from helping others, not from being powerful or wealthy. David and Leo visited her one afternoon, and when they saw her volunteering, they both smiled. Leo came up to her, holding a small toy in his hands. "You're doing good now, Mrs. Carter," Leo said, his voice full of innocent warmth. Mrs. Carter knelt down to his level. "Thank you, Leo. You were right about one thing. You helped me see the truth, and I'm grateful for it every day." The public's view of Mrs. Carter began to shift. They saw her not as the woman who slapped a child in a mall, but as someone who had learned from her mistakes. People began to believe in second chances, in the possibility of real change.